Canadians will long remember this sorry episode because they didn't actually enjoy the political theater. They were too busy worrying about the nest egg they saved up for their entire working lives, only to see it cut in half overnight. They were too busy worrying about how they'd pay for their kids' education or how they'd put food on the table for their families. And too many of them, and I saw this from coast to coast to coast, were feeling that fear in your guts that happens when you see something happen to your neighbor and you fear it's going to happen to you. They didn't find the spectacle in Ottawa all that interesting. They wanted action, and they haven't seen any from this government. If the stimulus contained in this budget has any hope of helping Canadians, it actually has to reach them. But this is a government more inclined to make commitments than to keep them. And so this afternoon, I will move to amend the budget motion to include new measures to ensure the government is held accountable for its promises. We are putting this government on probation. Accountability is something that Stephen Harper always says is important, and I agree with him. But this budget didn't include a single word about accountability. We will require reports to Parliament on the budget's implementation and its cost, one in March, one in June, one in December. Each of these reports, notice this, each of these reports will be an opportunity to withdraw our confidence should the government fail Canadians. We will vigilantly monitor its effects on our economy and every region of our country. We will be watching like hawks to make sure that the investments Canadians need actually reach them. And should Mr. Harper fail to satisfy the expectations of Canadians, we will be ready to defeat him.
How long can the Liberal Party continue to support the government, given that Mr. Dion was ridiculed for sitting on his hands or supporting the government for a long time? How long can that happen? 6 months, a year? What is your strategy?
I'm not going to enter into hypotheses, but we put down a very clear marker. This government has to get the money out the door. It has to protect the vulnerable. It has to create jobs. We will ask for reports. If it fails to meet those targets, this government will not survive long.
So are you saying there are these flaws, but they're not big enough flaws for us to demand that the government rectify them?
The issue is whether you go to an election. I said last week Canadians needed that like a hole in the head. It's also a matter of my responsibility as a political leader. This country is going into very tough times. I don't want to talk the economy down. I have confidence in Canadians. I have confidence in our capacity to rally together. But what they want from me is political action that shows a sense of responsibility. And I've tried to do that.
Did you warn him about this in your conversations with him, that you wanted to see those specific things in the budget?
I did not consult him in advance. I see no obligation to.
Well, did you tell him in your conversations with him that I want to see this stuff in the budget or you'll be in trouble?
We had conversations that were, as I think I have said before, cordial and businesslike. But I told the Prime Minister very clearly, I'm the leader of the opposition. He's the Prime Minister. It's his budget. It's not mine.
Can I just ask a follow-up? How much will your amendments cost? You're worried about the deficit. You say they don't have a plan to get out of it. Just roughly speaking.
The amendments, Julie, do not have fiscal implications. The amendments are accountability amendments. They're process amendments that say, you've got to come back to Parliament and tell Canadians whether you have delivered or not, yes or no. I very deliberately, in answer to a previous question, we excluded amendments which we thought would be fiscally irresponsible, in the sense that we would say, you know, we'll vote for this if you give us another $5 billion here or $5 billion there. I just don't think that's a responsible way for an opposition to act, and so we excluded that option.
Using Mr. Ignatieff's own criteria, this budget fails to protect the vulnerable, it fails to safeguard the jobs of today, and it fails to create the jobs that we need tomorrow. Nevertheless, Stephen Harper is going to remain in office because Michael Ignatieff has decided to keep him there. This is the first really important decision in public life that Mr. Ignatieff has had to make in his life. And what he decided to do was to stick with Mr. Dionne's unfortunate voting policy of propping up Mr. Harper. When the Liberals vote for Mr. Harper, with or without a fig leaf of an amendment, they will be casting their 45th straight vote to keep Stephen Harper in office. You can't do that and pretend to be the alternative to Mr. Harper. So to the hundreds of thousands of Canadians who voted for Mr. Ignatieff's party because they wanted to replace Stephen Harper, I simply say this. What you and I learned today is that you can't rely on Mr. Ignatieff to oppose Mr. Harper. If you oppose Mr. Harper and you want to replace him, I urge you to join with the New Democrats and support us in the next election.
What happens to the coalition? Is it dead? And what sort of breakup would you clarify it as?
Well, we have a new coalition on Parliament Hill. Let's be very clear. We have a coalition between Mr. Harper and Mr. Ignatieff. I can tell you that we will be opposing this coalition each and every day. It's about as formal as it gets.
The agreement that you signed in December that you were so proud of, that you were still selling over the weekend, what happens to that coalition? Please answer this precise question.
Mr. Ignatieff has made his choice. He has decided not to support the coalition, the positive change that it would have brought, and he has formed a relationship with Mr. Harper. He's keeping him in power, and this could last for a very long time.
What are the chances of getting any meaningful changes to this budget now that there's no longer a coalition?
Well, I think that Mr. Ignatieff has essentially given Mr. Harper the opportunity to govern for the foreseeable future. He didn't insist on significant changes to the budget at all. He simply required a couple of reports to be tabled. These could have been that could have been organized any number of ways using parliamentary procedure. Essentially, what he's done is far from holding Mr. Harper's feet to the fire. He's given him a get-out-of-jail card for free, and so I can understand why the Conservatives might be happy with these results.
That this is what has happened? Are you truly surprised that the Liberals are now supporting the Conservatives?
Well, I must admit I had hoped that that the Liberals would have made a decision to take a bold step. But unfortunately, they've fallen back to exactly the same practices as Mr. Dionne. Mr. Ignatieff has decided to follow in the footsteps of Mr. Dionne to continue supporting Mr. Harper. This is the 45th time that the Liberals will have propped up Mr. Harper. I think it was the wrong thing to do.
I mean, it's dead. I told Mr. Coder this morning when the Liberals came to me with their proposal and their amendment, did they show us the amendment? I said, correctly. I mean, they have their interest. Their defend interests are not in Quebec's interest. But I told Mr. Coder then that the coalition's dead. It's finished. It's over.
Just to be clear, Mr. Duceppe, if the Conservatives don't accept the Liberal amendment and the budget is defeated, you won't support a coalition?
I mean, there's no more coalition today, very clearly. And the other thing, if you want to bet that the Tories will say this is just unacceptable, they vote against that, I'd be very, 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 very surprised.